Hi, in this video, we are going to talk about dyslexia, what it is and what it looks like in different individuals. So we're going to look at that definition of dyslexia and peel it apart so that we have a better understanding of what it can look like in different individuals. But let's first start off with a few statistics. How common is dyslexia? Well, it's actually pretty common. There's some research that shows that as much as 15 to 20% of the population could have dyslexia or symptoms of dyslexia. And that's to say, it's really common, right? And if we look at that big bucket of learning disabilities, it's the most common. In fact, 80 to 90% of individuals with the learning disability are going to have dyslexia. And that's because it is the most common of all neurocognitive disorders. But this myth that it happens more in boys than girls is not true. We actually see this diagnosis in comparable numbers of boys and girls. And we can look at this bell curve to help us better understand these statistics. And that's because dyslexia is a continuum. There is a spectrum. So we can see it present in more severe cases or lighter cases, depending on the individual and where they fall on this bell curve. We can also use this bell curve to think about people who are learning to read in general, regardless of a diagnosis of dyslexia. So you're going to have those students there in the middle who are going to go to school, they're going to get their instruction, and they're going to learn to read effectively. But then, of course, we have individuals on either side of that middle piece as well. All right, let's take a look at the definition. But first, let's talk about some things that it's not. Dyslexia has nothing to do with how smart you are. It has nothing to do with your intelligence. It also has nothing to do with our vision or how we see. So let's talk about what it is. And we're going to use the definition from the International Dyslexia Association to help us better understand what this diagnosis of dyslexia actually means. So here's our definition, and wow, is it long. So let's break it apart. Here's our first sentence. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. So disability, that's our legal term, and it's a learning disability. That means we're going to see it affect how we learn, in this case, reading and writing. But neurobiological, that means it has to do with our brain. So here is the left side of our brain. And we can see this thanks to neuroimaging when different individuals are reading. So if we look at the brain of a typical reader, we're going to see this part of the brain kick on. And this is called the Broca's area. This is our language hub. We're also going to see two other parts of the brain kick in. And that one there on the bottom right, that's the part of our brain that processes the individual speech sounds. And we're going to see that part of the brain actually grow as we become more automatic fluent readers, because that's where our orthographic mapping is housed. And we'll talk more about that in a later video. But what's really interesting is if we look at the brain of somebody with dyslexia while they're reading, this is in fact what we see. There's an over-reliance on that Broca's area, that language processing, but the parts of the brain that are processing the individual speech sounds aren't working the way we expect them to, right? So all of that's to say it is neurobiological in origin. It has to do with how the brain works and how your brain is wired. Here's the next part of our definition of the diagnosis. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition, and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. Well, this makes a whole lot of sense if we break it apart and look at the different pieces. If I'm having a hard time reading, I'm going to have a hard time being accurate, or I'm not making mistakes. And if I have a hard time with my accuracy, how can I possibly be a fluent reader? And that reading and writing, the spelling and decoding, well, those go hand in hand. So we can look at the four language domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. They all are swirling in there together. And reading and writing go hand in hand. Reading always comes first. So if I'm having a hard time being fluent and accurate and decoding, well, of course, I'm going to have a hard time with my spelling as well. So we can use this sentence, which is something we would see for, kindergarten, first grade, for a reader who's breaking the code and learning how to read. they're going to be able to break apart these words and read them. So if I look at that final word, cat, I can break it apart, at, put it together, cat, right? So that's our decoding. But in order to do that, I have to know that C makes the k sound, A, T, t. And then I have to be able to hold on to those sounds, to put it together, say the word cat. That's our decoding, that's our reading. Spelling is encoding. That's the opposite, where we're gonna take that code and put it together. So if I wanted to spell that word big, I have to first hear the sounds b, I, g, and then attach a letter or letters to each of those sounds, okay? So if we look at a writing sample of somebody with dyslexia, we can see that that spelling, it's a struggle, right? And we actually are going to see oftentimes that spelling deteriorate as we move farther into the sentence or the writing piece. And that's because that cognitive load or that brain power is becoming harder. And then that fatigue kicks in, I'm becoming more and more tired. And so then I have less brain power to think through all the different pieces I have to do in order to be able to spell. So all of that's to say, reading, breaking apart the words and reading it is hard. So of course, accuracy, fluency, spelling are going to be negatively impacted as well. Here's that next piece. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. And now when we talk about dyslexia in English, this gets us to that core deficit, the main piece of the puzzle that's missing. And that's the phonological component. So English is a phonemic language. We have all of these different sounds that we can put together in different ways to make words and phrases and sentences and share our ideas. But that basic layer are the individual speech sounds. And if I'm having a hard time processing those individual speech sounds, of course, we're going to see that impact in all 4 language domains. So going back to our cat, and now I'm going to put the sounds up on the screen here in a second, but really I could be able to turn the lights off, close my eyes, do this completely in the dark. Phonological processing has nothing to do with the letters on the page. It is just doing something with those sounds that I hear. But here's our cat. I've got the sounds k, at, right? So I can break apart those sounds. If somebody tells me k, at, I can put them together and say the word cat. Maybe I'm going to change the k to now it's rat. Or change the to now it's mat. Maybe I'm going to change that final sound to p, now it's map, right? And I can keep going from there. So rhyming, alliteration, blending, segmenting, all of these are that phonological processing piece. And these are the skills that are required to become a fluent, skilled reader and writer. So we can look at this kind of big picture of phonological processing through this quote from Brady and Scarborough. And we're going to be talking a lot more about Scarborough as we move on through our modules, but let's start off with this quote. So phonological processing consists of multiple functions, lots of different skills, such as perceiving, interpreting, storing, recalling, and generating the speech sound system of our language. So it's those individual speech sounds. Here's the next part. And this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of what dyslexia is not. So all of these things are really hard for me, but those difficulties are unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. So basically, reading and writing is really hard for me, but I'm plenty smart enough. I've gone to school and I've been taught how to read, and the instruction that I have received has been effective and everything we want it to be, but this is still really hard. And that goes back to that core deficit of the phonological processing, and then all of these knock-on effects we can see from that. And it's also important to keep in mind that this cognitive ability, all of this stuff, it has to fit into that bigger framework of what is developmentally appropriate. And that's oftentimes the reason why we might not see a diagnosis of dyslexia until later on in someone's academic career when those expectations make that big jump. And to talk about that effective classroom instruction, here is Scarborough's reading rope. We're going to talk a lot more about this in later modules, but this is the model that we are going to be using to help us better understand that effective instruction and what that actually means. All right, we've talked about what it is. We've talked about how that's unexpected in relation to these other things that are in place. Now let's talk about some of these kind of knock-on or secondary consequences. So secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension. Well, obviously, right? If I'm having a hard time reading the words on the page, how can I possibly understand what I'm reading? And this simple view of reading is the model that we can see that clearly shows how that difficulty is going to be connected, right? So we know from our multiplication facts, if either one of those is a 0, well, my product is going to be a 0 as well. So if that decoding or word recognition part is a 0, well, obviously I'm going to struggle to understand what I'm reading. Here's that other knock-on effect, right? So if reading's really hard, I can't understand what I'm reading, then we have this reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. Again, all of this makes sense. Reading's really hard. I don't understand it. I don't want to do it. So therefore, my vocabulary and my background knowledge are not improving. And we can look at this within the larger framework of this transition from learning to read to reading to learn. Now, of course, every kid is totally different, but this is kind of the typical progression that we hope to see. So pre-K to second grade, we are learning to read. Now, of course, a lot of those early literacy skills are happening even before then, right? And that's where when you read to them, you see how the book works, all those concepts of print, all of that kind of stuff is taking place from the very beginning almost. But in pre-K and kindergarten, we are learning the foundations, right? We're learning how to break that code. We're doing our phonics. We're building our phonological awareness skills. We're doing all of these pieces. First grade is really pivotal. And we want to make sure that by the end of first grade, we have a lot of those pieces in place. And that's because moving into second grade, we're going to move into those more advanced phonics skills, and we're going to practice our fluency. We're going to practice, 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 practice. And that's what helps us become more fluent, right? And we know that English is a complex spelling system. We hear that all the time. It does actually make sense, and we'll talk more about that in a later module, but it does take time to work our way through all of these different spelling patterns. And that's why it's really important that we're continuing those phonics skills all the way through second grade, and then actually we're carrying on third on. It takes years to learn the spelling system of English. It does. But third grade is really pivotal. And that's where we typically hope to see students transitioning to becoming skilled readers. So we learned all of those skills, how to break the code, how to break apart words, how to spell words, all of that stuff. We practiced, practiced, practiced. Now we're starting to make that transition to reading to learn. So third grade is really pivotal because this is the year where we're going to hit pause, look back and make sure there are no gaps and fill in them if they are, and we're going to continue to practice. So that moving into fourth grade and up, we are now ready to read to learn, right? So think of your history class. A history teacher is not teaching you how to read. They expect you to be able to take the assigned text, read it, do something with it, and then talk about it or write about it or whatever the expectation is. And that's that big shift. And what happens is when we make that shift to where we are now reading to learn, the biggest way that we acquire vocabulary, background knowledge, language knowledge, all of that stuff comes through our reading. And that's also where we see this shift to the more formal writing and this kind of big picture that we call academic language. So in fourth and fifth grade, they're kind of getting to move their way into that academic language. So that moving into middle school and beyond, they have the requisite skills needed to effectively operate within this world of academic formal language. Now, this is the sort of typical developing what we hope to see. And a big part of that is the instruction, that the instruction was high quality, it was effective. Of course, if we see a diagnosis of dyslexia, then this might shift and be a little later, but this is a really important process that we need our readers to go through. So what happens sometimes if we are still struggling to read in 3rd grade is we are not ready for that shift. I am still in that learning to read phase. And that's okay. And we can address that through intervention and through all these other great stuff that we're going to be talking about. But the reality is that the expectations within the classroom and within school, there's a big jump, right? So we need to make sure that we are prepared for that jump. And when we're not, there are some negative things that can happen. A big piece is our language development, right? So like we talked about vocabulary, sentence structure, all of that stuff. The big way we're going to move into that academic side is through our reading. And that's because the way that we write and the language that we use when we write is different than the language we use when we talk, right? It's kind of that next level. Writing, right? Reading and writing go hand in hand. Reading always comes first. Well, if I'm struggling to read, of course I'm going to struggle to write, right? They go hand in hand. And if I'm struggling to read, well, I don't want to do it, right? It's hard. And if I know that it's hard, why would I want to do it? And what happens, unfortunately, is when we are repeatedly asked to do something on a daily basis that we know is really hard, that confidence can go down. And that's where we want to really make sure that we have that strong network around your child to make sure that that confidence doesn't take the knock. Because that, unfortunately, is one of those things that's just really hard to bring back. All right. That's not to say that this is doomsday talk. It's just that we have a better understanding of this definition, right? But what we can see happen sometimes is this Matthew effect of reading. And that is what we call that downward spiral. So there is our definition of dyslexia. It is a specific learning disability, right? There's our legal term. It's neurobiological. It's in the brain. We're going to have a hard time reading, which means we're going to have a hard time spelling. We're going to have a hard time understanding what we're reading. We're going to have a hard time learning new words and learning to spell all of these pieces, but it comes down to this core deficit of phonological processing. But these difficulties are unexpected in relation to how smart I am, how effective my instruction has been, all of these other pieces. So let's talk very quickly about intervention, right? So it sounds like this was a lot of doomsday talk, but it's not, right? Dyslexia is not a life sentence. And a big part of that is because we have all of these strengths, right? So this is not doomsday talk. We know how to address this. And we can do that through this strengths-based approach. And this again goes back to neuroimaging and all the cool stuff we know about what happens in the brain. So if we know that these parts of the brain maybe aren't working as well or as strong as we hope them to, well, we know how to bring in the other parts of the brain to support those. And what's really cool is that this brain science, the science of reading all this stuff, it works. We know it works. And what's really cool as well is if we start intensive, effective intervention, we could actually rewire the brain, which is pretty cool. But it does take time. And we're going to talk a lot more about intervention in our next module. But let's wrap up with some things that dyslexia is not, right? So again, it has nothing to do with how smart I am. It has nothing to do with how hard I work. I am not stupid. I am not lazy. It's just that my brain works a little differently, right? It has nothing to do with vision, right? It's not that I see the letters or the words backwards. Not to do with dyslexia at all. But the reason we see a lot of those reversals, right, for our BDPQ, which first of all is a totally normal step in learning to read and write. And that's because that, again, that's how our brain works. If I take a chair and I turn it upside down or any which way, well, my brain still sees it as a chair. But if for some reason I take this circle and a stick and I turn it any which way, it has a totally different sound. So now imagine if your brain is having a hard time differentiating between b and d, the sounds, which again, they sound really similar. And then I'm supposed to remember that these are somehow connected to this random thing that looks really similar. obviously we're going to have difficulty. And again, that's a very typical process in that learning to read and spelling process. Every kid goes through it. But if we have a diagnosis of dyslexia, it might be even more difficult. And again, that goes back to that phonological processing component. A few more myths, right? There is no magic cure or magic potion. It's not like I'm going to take this pill or read this one book and it magically goes away. And that's because it is a lifelong diagnosis. Dyslexia, you don't grow out of it. Your brain just works that way. That's always how it's going to be. But like we just talked about, through intervention, we can diminish those symptoms. And in some cases, we can even rewire the brain. So all of that is to say, we know what dyslexia is. We know how it affects us. We know what we can do to support somebody with dyslexia. So your child will learn, will be successful, and will thrive.